The German 88mm anti-tank gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, became the most effective anti-tank gun of World War II. The 88mm fired multiple types of ammunition, but the most common anti-tank round was the Panzergranat 39, a solid armor-piercing shell with a ballistic cap and explosive filler. The shell weighed approximately 10 kilograms, 22 pounds. It consisted of a hardened steel core designed to punch through armor, a ballistic cap to improve aerodynamics and prevent shattering on impact, and a small explosive charge in the base that detonated after penetration. The explosive charge was not large, approximately 60 grams of TNT, but it was sufficient to fragment the shell and create lethal shrapnel inside the target. The shell's velocity was critical to its effectiveness. The 88mm gun fired shells at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,600 feet per second, 800 meters per second. At this velocity, the kinetic energy of the shell was immense. When the shell struck armor, the energy had to go somewhere. If the armor was too thick or too angled, the shell shattered or ricocheted. If the armor was penetrable, the shell punched through, and the energy was transferred into the interior of the tank. The physics of armor penetration involved several factors: the hardness of the shell, the thickness and angle of the armor, and the velocity of impact. The 88mm shell was designed to remain intact during penetration. The hardened steel core resisted shattering. The ballistic cap absorbed initial impact stresses. Once through the armor, the shell's base fuse detonated the explosive charge, fragmenting the shell into dozens of high-velocity shrapnel pieces. The lethality of the 88mm against Allied tanks was well documented. American M4 Shermans, British Cromwells, and Soviet T-34s were all vulnerable to 88mm fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. German tank crews and anti-tank gun crews were trained to aim for the front of enemy tanks where the driver and bow gunner sat, or the turret where the commander, gunner, and loader were located. A penetrating hit to either location was usually fatal to multiple crew members. Allied tankers feared the 88mm. The gun's range, accuracy, and penetration capability meant that German gunners could engage Allied tanks before Allied tanks could effectively return fire. The psychological effect was significant. Crews knew that a single 88mm hit could kill them all. The sound of an 88mm firing, a sharp, distinctive crack, caused immediate panic. Crews learned to recognize the sound and take evasive action, though often it was too late. The crew inside the Sherman did not see the shell coming. At 2,600 feet per second, the shell was supersonic. It arrived before the sound of the gun firing. The first indication was the impact. The shell struck the Sherman's frontal armor with tremendous force. The impact sounded like a massive hammer blow, a sharp, metallic clang that reverberated through the entire tank. Crew members described it as the loudest sound they had ever heard, louder than their own gun firing. The noise was accompanied by a violent jolt. The entire tank shook. Crew members were thrown against their seats or control stations. If the shell penetrated, there was a fraction of a second between impact and the shell entering the crew compartment. The penetration created a hole approximately 88mm in diameter. The shell, now slightly deformed but still largely intact, entered at high velocity. Behind it came a spray of molten metal, fragments of the armor that had been liquefied by the friction and heat of penetration. This spray, called spalling, consisted of white-hot metal fragments traveling at high velocity in all directions inside the tank. The crew's experience depended on where they were relative to the penetration point. The driver and assistant driver sat in the front of the hull. If the shell penetrated the front armor, they were directly in the path. The shell struck one or both of them, killing them instantly or causing catastrophic injuries. The commander, gunner, and loader were in the turret. If the shell entered the hull, they might survive the initial penetration, though spalling could reach them. Crew members in the direct path of the shell had no time to react. Death was instantaneous. The shell's kinetic energy was sufficient to dismember or decapitate a human body. Crew members struck by the shell were killed so quickly They likely did not register pain or awareness. For them, combat ended in a fraction of a second. Crew members not in the direct path but in the vicinity experienced secondary effects. The shell's explosive charge detonated inside the tank, fragmenting the shell into shrapnel. Dozens of steel fragments, each moving at hundreds of feet per second, ricocheted inside the confined space. Fragments struck crew members, equipment, ammunition, and fuel. The fragments caused penetrating injuries, wounds to the torso, limbs, and head. Some crew members were killed by shrapnel. Others were wounded but survived. The spalling, molten metal fragments, caused burns and lacerations. The fragments were small but extremely hot. They set fire to clothing, equipment, and anything flammable inside the tank. Crew members' faces, hands, and exposed skin were burned. The pain was immediate and intense. The concussive force of the explosion inside the confined space caused additional trauma. The blast wave compressed the air, causing overpressure injuries to lungs and eardrums. Crew members' ears bled. Some lost consciousness from the concussion. Others remained conscious but were disoriented, unable to hear or think clearly. Within 3 seconds of impact, the immediate effects were complete. Crew members were either dead, wounded, or unharmed. The next challenge was survival, escaping the tank before secondary effects killed those who had survived the initial hit. The immediate penetration and explosion were only the beginning. The secondary effects, fire and ammunition detonation, often killed crew members who survived the initial hit. Fire was the most common secondary effect. The 88mm shell's explosive charge ignited flammable materials inside the tank. Sherman tanks carried 174 rounds of 75mm ammunition stored throughout the hull and turret. The ammunition consisted of brass cases filled with propellant and projectiles. If the propellant ignited, the ammunition cooked off. The rounds exploded without being fired from the gun. The tank also carried gasoline. The Sherman's engine was powered by a gasoline engine, and fuel tanks held approximately 175 gallons. Gasoline is highly flammable. If the fuel tanks were ruptured by the shell or shrapnel, gasoline spilled into the crew compartment and engine compartment. The heat from the shell, the sparks from metal fragments, or the flames from burning equipment ignited the gasoline. Once ignited, gasoline fires spread rapidly. Crew members described fire as the worst aspect of being hit. The fire consumed oxygen, making breathing difficult. Smoke filled the interior, reducing visibility to 0. The heat was intense. Temperatures inside a burning tank exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Crew members' clothing caught fire. Exposed skin blistered and charred. Ammunition detonation was catastrophic. When ammunition cooked off, the rounds exploded inside the tank. Each explosion sent shrapnel and concussive force through the interior. Multiple rounds detonating in sequence created a chain reaction. The tank became a death trap. Crew members who survived the initial penetration and fire were killed by exploding ammunition. The time from initial hit to catastrophic fire or ammunition detonation varied. In some cases, fire started immediately. In others, it took 30 seconds to a minute. The critical factor was whether the shell or shrapnel had struck ammunition or fuel directly. If so, the fire started instantly. If not, heat and flames spread gradually until they reached flammable materials. Crew members had seconds to escape. The instinct to survive drove men to move despite injuries, fire, and smoke. The commander's hatch, the loader's hatch, and the driver's hatch were the escape routes. However, hatches could be jammed by the impact or blocked by damaged equipment. Crew members had to force them open or find alternative exits. The crew member's position determined their chances of escape. The commander, located at the top of the turret, with a hatch directly above him, had the best chance. He could open the hatch and climb out in seconds. The loader, also in the turret with a hatch, had a similar chance. The gunner, seated below and to the side of the commander, had to climb over the commander's position to reach the hatch. This took longer and reduced his chances. The driver and assistant driver, located in the front hull, had the worst chances. Their hatches were in the front of the tank, difficult to open quickly and often blocked by damaged equipment. If fire started in the engine compartment behind them, they were trapped between the fire and the front armor. Many drivers and assistant drivers died trying to escape. Crew members who escaped described the experience as desperate. They climbed over dead or wounded comrades, pushed past flames, and forced open hatches with their hands or tools. Some crew members were partially burned or injured but escaped. Others did not make it. Their bodies were found inside the burned-out tank after the battle. The experience of being hit varied by crew position. The commander, gunner, and loader, located in the turret, had different experiences than the driver and assistant driver in the hull. The commander sat in the turret, elevated above the other crew members, with a cupola and periscopes, providing 360-degree visibility. He was responsible for directing the tank, identifying targets, and commanding the crew. When the 88mm shell hit, the commander often saw the muzzle flash from the German gun and had a fraction of a second to react. Some commanders instinctively shouted, "Incoming!" before the shell arrived. Most did not have time. If the shell penetrated the hull rather than the turret, the commander's chances of survival were higher. He was above the penetration point. Spalling and shrapnel might reach him, but the direct impact was below. His first action after the hit was to assess the situation. Who was hit? Where was the damage? Was the tank on fire? If fire was spreading or ammunition was cooking off, the commander ordered, "Bail out!" and began evacuating. The commander's hatch was directly above him. He could open it and climb out in seconds. However, his responsibility was to ensure his crew escaped. Some commanders stayed inside to help wounded crew members, sacrificing their own lives. Others escaped first, which was procedurally correct. The commander's survival meant someone could report what happened and lead the crew if any survived. The gunner sat to the right of the gun, below the commander. His position was more confined. He looked through a periscope or telescopic sight, his face pressed against the optics. When the shell hit, the concussion often caused him to strike his face against the sight, causing lacerations and broken teeth. If the shell penetrated the turret, the gunner was in direct danger. Shrapnel and spalling struck him from multiple directions. The gunner's escape route was through the commander's hatch or the loader's hatch. Both required him to move from his position, which was difficult in the confined turret. If the commander was wounded or killed, the gunner had to move the commander's body or climb over it. If fire was spreading, the gunner had seconds to decide whether to help others or escape. Gunners who survived hits described the decision as agonizing. They wanted to help the driver or loader, but the fire and smoke made it impossible to see or breathe. Some gunners attempted to rescue wounded crew members and died in the attempt. Others escaped and lived with guilt for not saving their comrades. The loader sat to the left of the gun, responsible for loading rounds into the breech. His position was physically demanding. He had to lift 75mm rounds weighing 30 to 40 pounds repeatedly during combat. When the shell hit, the loader was often holding a round or reaching for one. If the shell penetrated near the ammunition storage, the loader was in extreme danger. Exploding ammunition killed loaders frequently. The loader's hatch was above and to the left. It was easier for the loader to escape than the gunner because he was closer to his hatch. However, if the loader was wounded by the initial hit, he could not climb out. Loaders who survived described pulling themselves up through the hatch despite severe injuries, broken bones, burns, shrapnel wounds. Adrenaline and survival instinct drove them. The relationship between the crew members affected survival. Crews that trained together, fought together, and trusted each other coordinated better during crises. When a tank was hit, crew members helped each other instinctively. The commander pulled the gunner toward the hatch. The loader helped the wounded driver. This cooperation increased survival rates. Crews that were new or poorly trained panicked, and individuals acted independently, reducing overall survival. The driver and assistant driver seated in the front hull faced the greatest danger when a tank was hit. Their position made them the primary targets for frontal hits, and their escape options were limited. The driver sat in the left front of the hull, controlling the tank's movement via steering levers and pedals. His visibility was limited to a narrow periscope. He could not see what was happening outside except directly in front. When the tank was hit from the front, the driver often had no warning. The shell struck the armor inches from his position. If the shell penetrated, it struck the driver directly or passed close enough that spalling and shrapnel killed or wounded him. Drivers hit directly by an 88mm shell died instantly. The kinetic energy of the shell was sufficient to sever limbs or destroy the torso. Some drivers' bodies were found in 2 pieces after the tank was recovered. Others were so severely damaged that identification was difficult. Death was instantaneous, and the driver likely felt no pain. If the shell penetrated near but not directly on the driver, he faced spalling and shrapnel. Hot metal fragments struck his face, hands, and torso. Drivers wore tanker helmets and goggles, which provided minimal protection. Fragments penetrated the helmet or struck exposed skin. Burns and lacerations were common. Some drivers lost vision when fragments struck their eyes. Others suffered burns to their hands from touching hot metal surfaces as they tried to escape. The driver's escape route was through a hatch in the front of the hull. The hatch opened forward and upward. In theory, the driver could open the hatch and climb out. In practice, this was difficult. The hatch was heavy and required effort to open. If the tank was on fire or filled with smoke, the driver could not see the hatch latch. If the driver was wounded, he lacked the strength to force the hatch open. Many drivers died trapped in their seats, unable to escape. The assistant driver sat to the right of the driver. His role was to operate the bow machine gun and assist the driver with navigation. His position was similarly confined and vulnerable. When an 88mm shell penetrated the front hull, the assistant driver faced the same threats as the driver: direct impact, spalling, and shrapnel. Assistant drivers had slightly better visibility than drivers because they operated the machine gun and had a gun port. However, this provided no advantage when the tank was hit. The gun port was a weak point in the armor. Some 88mm shells penetrated through the gun port, entering the hull directly. In these cases, the assistant driver was killed immediately. The assistant driver's escape route was also through a front hatch. The challenges were identical to the driver's: a heavy hatch, limited visibility, smoke, fire, and injuries. Assistant drivers who survived described the escape as a desperate struggle. They forced open the hatch using their hands, feet, or tools. They climbed out while on fire or bleeding. Some collapsed outside the tank and were pulled to safety by infantry. Others escaped and ran despite severe injuries. The survival rate for drivers and assistant drivers was significantly lower than for turret crew. Post-battle analyses of destroyed tanks showed that drivers and assistant drivers were killed more frequently than commanders, gunners, or loaders. The position was inherently more dangerous, and the escape options were worse. Some drivers and assistant drivers survived by abandoning the tank before it was hit. If the tank was disabled by a track being blown off or the engine being damaged, the crew could evacuate before an 88mm shell struck. Experienced crews learned to recognize when a tank was targeted and evacuated preemptively. However, this was not always possible. In the chaos of combat, crew members often did not realize they were in danger until the shell hit. Survival after an 88mm hit was determined by multiple factors. Some were technical: armor thickness, shell angle, location of hit. Others were human: crew training, reaction time, cohesion. And some were simply luck. Armor thickness and angle were critical. The Sherman's frontal armor was 76mm thick, sloped at 47 degrees. The slope increased the effective thickness to approximately 110mm. Against an 88mm shell, this was insufficient at close range, but occasionally sufficient at longer ranges. If the shell struck at a steep angle, it might ricochet rather than penetrate. Ricochets saved tanks. The shell struck, deflected upward, and flew over the tank. The crew felt the impact, but survived. The location of the hit mattered. A shell that penetrated the front hull near the driver was more lethal than a shell that penetrated the side of the turret. A shell that struck ammunition storage caused catastrophic secondary explosions. A shell that missed critical components, engine, fuel, ammunition, caused less damage. Crews whose tanks were hit in less critical areas had better survival rates. Crew training affected survival significantly. Well-trained crews reacted faster. When hit, they immediately assessed damage, identified who was wounded, and began evacuation procedures. The commander gave clear orders. Crew members moved efficiently despite smoke and fire. Escape hatches were opened quickly. Wounded crew members were assisted. Poorly trained crews panicked. Individual crew members acted independently, blocking each other's escape routes. Time was wasted trying to fight the fire or save equipment instead of evacuating. Crew members froze in shock, unable to move. Poorly trained crews had higher casualties. Experience also mattered. Veteran crews had survived previous hits or seen other tanks destroyed. They knew what to expect. When hit, they did not freeze. They moved immediately toward escape hatches. Veteran crews evacuated faster than inexperienced crews, and their survival rates were higher. Luck was the final and perhaps most important factor. The exact point where the shell struck, whether it hit ammunition, whether the fuel tank ruptured, whether the escape hatch jammed, all were matters of chance. Two identical tanks hit by identical shells could have different outcomes. One crew died, another escaped. Post-battle analysis often concluded that survival was as much luck as anything else. Some crews developed superstitions. They painted names or symbols on their tanks, believing it brought luck. They followed rituals before battle, prayers, specific routines, wearing certain items. These had no measurable effect on survival, but they provided psychological comfort. Crews that believed they had some control over their fate, even if illusory, performed better under stress than crews that felt helpless. Crew members who survived an 88mm hit and escaped the tank faced immediate challenges: enemy fire, injuries, and the psychological trauma of watching comrades die. Escaping the tank did not mean safety. The battlefield was still active. German machine guns and artillery targeted escaping crew members. Tankers who bailed out were exposed on open ground, often hundreds of yards from cover. Some were shot while climbing out of the tank. Others ran toward friendly lines and were hit by enemy fire. Survival required reaching cover quickly: a ditch, a hedgerow, or friendly infantry positions. Injuries complicated escape. Crew members with burns, broken bones, or shrapnel wounds struggled to run. Some collapsed after escaping the tank, too weak to continue. Medics or friendly infantry had to retrieve them under fire. Some wounded crew members died from their injuries before receiving medical treatment. Others survived but required evacuation to field hospitals. The psychological trauma was immediate and severe. Crew members who escaped watched their tank burn, with comrades still inside. They heard screams as crew members trapped inside died. They saw the tank explode when ammunition detonated. The guilt of surviving when others died was crushing. Some crew members broke down immediately, weeping or vomiting. Others went into shock, staring blankly, unresponsive to questions. Survivors were questioned by officers. What happened? Where was the enemy gun? How many tanks were hit? The survivors often could not answer. They had not seen the gun. The hit occurred too fast. They focused on escaping, not observing tactical details. Officers pressed for information, but survivors had little to give. Recovery took days or weeks. Physically injured crew members were treated in field hospitals. Burns were cleaned and bandaged. Broken bones were set. Shrapnel wounds were sutured. Some crew members required surgery or evacuation to rear hospitals. Recovery times varied from weeks to months, depending on injury severity. Psychological recovery took longer. Crew members who survived 88mm hits were often reassigned to new tanks with new crews. They returned to combat within days. There was no time for psychological recovery. The trauma was not discussed. Crew members were expected to function. Many did, suppressing their emotions and continuing to fight. Others could not. They froze during combat, refused to enter tanks, or broke down under stress. These men were reassigned to non-combat roles or evacuated for psychiatric treatment. Post-traumatic stress, called battle fatigue or shell shock during World War II, affected many survivors. Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness were common. Survivors heard the sound of the 88mm firing in their minds, triggering panic. They avoided loud noises. They startled easily. Some survivors struggled with guilt for decades after the war, believing they should have saved their comrades. The bond between surviving crew members was intense. Men who escaped a burning tank together shared a trauma that others could not understand. These survivors often stayed in contact after the war, attending reunions and supporting each other. The shared experience created a lifelong connection. The 88mm shell's lethality defined tank combat in World War II. Allied tank crews feared it more than any other weapon. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical. Crews knew that if an 88mm gun was present, their survival was uncertain. The statistical evidence confirmed the fear. Analysis of destroyed Allied tanks showed that 88mm guns accounted for a disproportionate number of kills. In Normandy, over 50% of destroyed Sherman tanks were attributed to 88mm guns, or German tanks armed with 88mm cannons, Tiger and King Tiger tanks. The 88mm's range, accuracy, and penetration made it the dominant anti-tank weapon. Allied forces attempted to counter the 88mm threat. Tactics included flanking maneuvers to avoid frontal engagements, using terrain to limit sightlines, coordinating infantry and artillery to suppress anti-tank guns before tank advances, deploying tank destroyers with heavier guns to engage German armor at range. These tactics reduced losses but could not eliminate the threat. The 88mm remained lethal throughout the war. Tank design improvements were implemented. Later, Sherman models had thicker armor and better ammunition storage to reduce fire risk. British tanks like the Churchill had heavier armor. Soviet tanks like the T-34 had sloped armor that improved protection. However, no Allied tank was immune to 88mm fire. Even the heaviest Allied tanks could be penetrated at close range. The experience of being hit by an 88mm shell left a lasting impact on survivors. Veterans of tank combat described it as the most terrifying moment of their lives. The sound, the impact, the fire, the deaths of comrades. These memories stayed with them forever. Many survivors refused to discuss their experiences for decades. In the post-war period, tank design philosophy shifted. Armor thickness increased. Main guns became more powerful. Crew survivability became a design priority. Modern tanks have blowout panels to direct ammunition explosions away from the crew. Crew compartments are separated from fuel and ammunition storage. Escape hatches are larger and easier to operate. These improvements were driven by the lessons learned in World War II, including the deadly effectiveness of the 88mm shell. The 88mm anti-tank gun is remembered as one of the most effective weapons of World War II. Its design influenced post-war anti-tank guns and tank cannons. The fear it inspired among Allied tank crews is documented in countless memoirs, interviews, and historical analyses. The question, what happened inside a tank hit by an 88mm shell, has a simple but horrifying answer. Death, fire, and desperate struggle for survival. For those who lived through it, the memory never faded.